Today, we're going to be hearing from Raj Patel, an accomplished writer, professor, and activist. He's written books such as Stuffed and Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World Food System, The Value of Nothing, and A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. He also contributes to The Guardian regularly and co-hosts a food politics podcast called The Secret Ingredient. So a big thank you to Raj for coming out today and talking with us. In your book, Stuffed and Starved, that came out in 2008, you look at the relationship between how food is grown, who is growing the food, and who gets to eat the food. The reality continues today. Recently, the UN warned that globally we're going to be facing famines of biblical proportion due to the impact of COVID-19. Could you give us an overview of the global food system so we could better understand what's going on with the food system today?
Thank you, Anne, and thank all y'all. I'm in Texas, and I need to explain. And I've been here for long enough that now I have a license to say y'all, and I will be doing that. It's either y'all or comrades, and probably comrades is better for this crowd. Still, I'm excited to be here and pissed that I have to be doing this work because. The writing's been on the wall, as you said so eloquently, Anne, for a very long time. I mean, the global food system has been arranged through imperial capitalism in particular to look like an hourglass where there are millions of farmers, billions of consumers, and a monopoly concentration of power in the middle. So, millions of farmers and the supply chain tightens right up there. And then we have a few sort of distributors, and then the billions of us who struggle to eat every day if we can. Now, that food system and that concentration of power isn't new. It may be obvious today to observe that there are 4 or 5 large meat companies, Tyson, ConAgra, JBS, what have you. But in the early 1900s, the grain trading empires were similarly concentrated. You had Archer Daniels, Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and there was one that begins with D, which I'm completely blanking on. It will come to me. Dreyfus. There. So you have this sort of structure of monopoly built into the food system, and you have structures of hunger built into it too. One of the examples that is tremendously important to understand comes from someone who will be speaking to everyone next week, Mike Davis, who has a fantastic observation in his wonderful and not read enough book, Late Victorian Holocausts. And so the story he tells is a story about how climate change works in the 19th century. And he observes that India at the beginning of the 19th century has these sort of periodic El Nino cycles, but that in general, before the British really sink their teeth into the Indian economy, and when India is still a feudal economy, that when bad weather events happen, there is still the sort of noblesse oblige of feudalism to be able to ensure that workers, peasants, have enough to eat. So, if there's a famine, if the waters, if there's a plague, if things go sideways, murder hornets, whatever it is, if something bad happens to the harvest, the lords have to feed the peasants. By the end of the 19th century, though, the British have succeeded in imposing a system of liberal capitalism. And India is exporting more food than is ever produced. And by this metric, the export economy is riding high and everyone's doing great, except that more people are going hungry in India than ever before. And the figure that Davis finds is that there's a famine every 4 years by the end of the British tenure in India. But in all of India's recorded history before the British arrived, there's a famine every 120 years. So, you have to wait a century and a half for the next famine to happen. Things have to get really catastrophically bad. Whereas under liberalism, things are repeated with a certain amount of regularity. And very interesting, if you think that I'm delving too deeply into history, it's important to remember that these kinds of arguments for liberal capitalism, that, yes, it's, there are some bad things that are attendant, but they're an accident and we can do our best to fix this problem of hunger. But actually what we need is open borders and food flowing everywhere. Well, that argument is in The Economist today as their dire warning about how it is that we should not cede into protectionism and that we should not let illiberal ideas overtake the global economy. So the idea, so, just to sort of frame it as best I can, and in terms of a short version, a short history of the global food system, what we're seeing is the rise to power of certain elements of capitalism. Initially it's about sort of colonial capitalism that's about controlling land directly through settler colonialism, as in the United States, or the kind of imperial capitalism that you see in India. And you have chains of supply that are about sucking wealth, value, and commodities from poorer parts of the world, impoverished parts of the world, to colonial metropoles. In that process, you create new kinds of poverty. And those new kinds of poverty are deepened with every structural crisis where you have an increase in the power of monopoly capital and of structural monopolies within the food system. And so it's not surprising, particularly in the food system, to observe that poverty and working in the food system go hand in hand. 7 out of the 10 worst paying jobs in America are in the food system. And it's not just about working in the fields, but it's about minimum tip wage. It's it's about working for tips. It's about and that long legacy of colonial of racialized capitalism and slavery that attends the idea of tipping and the idea that there should be some people who can only be educated in the virtues of a good service and civility through tipping. And that idea of tipping and the food system, of course, go hand in hand, because this country was built through enslaved people working through the food system. But throughout the history of the food system, you have classes of poverty that are about workers in the food system. And so it's not surprising right now that as the shit hits the fan in the food system, it is the food system workers who are both the most impoverished and considered the most essential, which is to say that they are sacrificial under capitalism. These are the workers, poor, disproportionately people of color, and in certain sectors disproportionately women, who are being thrown into the meat grinder so that so that hamburgers can be produced.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I ask the next question, we have a little comment from Drew, I believe. Is it possible if you could slow down just a little bit?
Drew, thank you for your question.
If it's possible.
Of course, I'll do my best, but I do normally talk this fast. But I want to cover as much as I can and then offer also speedy responses to questions. But there's a lot to cover. We've got such little time, but I will do my best, Drew.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. So going into the next question. Until relatively recently, the threat of global warming wasn't yet on the minds of everyday people. But in recent years, the environmental movement has gotten more attention, and today, with just a few exceptions, most people recognize the terrifying realization of the possibility of environmental collapse worldwide. Could you give us your view of the situation that we'll be confronting and the impact on the global food system?
I'm going to try and reject the premise of the question in a way that's constructive. When we think about climate change, farmers, particularly peasants in the global south, have been at the front lines of this for ages. It's true that the urban proletariat may not have quite witnessed the kinds of catastrophic change that the peasantry has in the global south, but it has been happening. And so, it's been very interesting to be part of groups like La Via Campesina, the international peasant movement, that has over 200 million members now. And that movement of 200 million radical landless people, farmers, farm workers, has been saying for a while that climate change is real, that what they're up against is far less regular rains or far more intense rains, wider degrees of uncertainty, the arrival of new kinds of pests, and the arrival of sort of concentrated weather events and cataclysmic weather events. That's been going on for a good bit. And yes, La Via Campesina is a global organization. I mean, in the United States, we've got groups like the National Family Farm Coalition, who are part of it, but the Border Workers Coalition, I believe is the name in El Paso, are also part of it. And there's a range of local movements that constitute a national membership of La Via Campesina, and then there's an international part. And although we have fewer peasants than, say, India, where the Karnataka State Farmers Association alone brings 200 million members to that, or the Brazilian Rural Landless Workers Movement, the MST, has 1 million members. The US does have peasants and people who identify as peasants who are militants in struggle right here. So I mention all of that because farmers have been at the front lines of what it is to experience climate change for a fair amount. And particularly people in the global south have been. And what we saw last time as a result of both the intersection of climate change and the result of the Great Recession is something that's worth thinking about right now. I want to tell you a story about how climate change is not really the weather. Climate change, we experience weather every day, but to experience climate change is to experience the intersection of capitalism and the weather and the human systems that exist between us and the histories of those human systems. So here's a story about fire and weather and global trade and capitalists. And it's a story that begins, I believe, in 2010 in Russia, where Russia's having an unusually hot weather event. It's one of these 1 in 500 year droughts. Now, because it's 2010 and everyone's going through austerity, Russia has done a couple of things that a lot of countries did. It cut back on its public services, so particularly cut back on firefighters, and it privatized. It sold assets to capitalists. In particular, it allowed capitalists to deforest and to take native, to take wild forests and turn them into lumber. So you have clear cutting, you have lots of kindling left on the ground, and it's unsurprising then that when you have one of these 1 in 500 year weather events, there's a fire, and it's a huge fire. It is beyond containment, in part because it's so big, and in part because the people who were going to contain it have been laid off because of austerity and neoliberal reforms. And the fire spreads, and it starts to threaten grain. In particular, it starts to threaten wheat. Russia's the third largest wheat exporter. And we don't know quite what the sort of causality is here, but there are globally a few incredibly powerful wheat trading companies. One of them in Switzerland approached the Russian ambassador and talked about the possibility of Russia getting into deep trouble if it exported its wheat and the price of wheat went high. You remember Mark Rich, one of these Wall Street, particularly successfully prosecuted Wall Street criminals who then ran away to Switzerland. Well, one of the trading companies he set up suggested to Russia that, and the name of this company is Glencore, by the way. So one of the representatives from Glencore says, look, Russia, you should stop exporting grain because then you'll be able to feed everyone within Russia and you won't have these price spikes that might happen as a result of declining incomes and austerity and fire. And a few days later, Russia imposes a grain export ban. So again, the intersection of capitalism, Russia's production, flow of grain into the world, and climate and weather. But the impact is global because the World Trade Organization and the US Imperial Project through the WTO has been about rationalizing grain production. That means that countries that had grain stores have gradually been privatizing them. And that means that there was a huge spike in the levels of, a huge spike in grain prices. And that caused protests around food around the world. In particular, it caused protests for bread in Mozambique. Now, this is odd because wheat is not native to Mozambique. Mozambique doesn't grow wheat. Wheat doesn't grow in that part of southern Africa. But because it had been colonized by Angola, it had become normal for folk in Mozambique, sorry, by Portugal. It had become normal in parts of Mozambique and throughout Mozambique to think that to have dignity in your day, you need to have your daily bread. So when the price of bread went through the roof, the Mozambican government found itself confronted by protesters. And what did the protesters want? They wanted cheap bread. And the government, the police started firing tear gas at the protesters. And because of austerity, they had not spent enough on tear gas, so they went to live ammunition, which they had plenty of. And as a result, dozens of people were killed by the police in what was a food and climate and worker intersection. So the story here is about the global trade system. It's about the power of Glencore and the power of finance. It is about the webs of trade and the history of colonialism that mean that folk in Mozambique want bread. And it's about the politics of austerity, of cutting back in order to be able to pay your debts that that we are soon to be falling into in the United States or and around the world. But which is important to remember as we come out of what appears when we come out of this great this depression, the austerity that will be prescribed by neoliberals will be precisely a war on the poor, even more than has been in the past. So this is a way of unasking the question a little bit, Anne, but by a way of enriching how it is that in fact a lot of people have already been on the front lines of climate change and austerity, and this is an example from the past, but we can look to similar things in future.
Got it. Thank you. Now, I think all of us here recognize that inequality has always been a fixture of this society, and that the way food is produced is simply a facet of the inequality experienced by us all. Maybe you could give us your views on the lasting effects that this pandemic will have on the people of the world, both in countries whose economies have been dominated and distorted by colonial and imperialist powers, as well as in the advanced imperialist and industrial countries.
Well, it depends, doesn't it? I mean, are we going to be successful in revolution or not? The story right now is apocalyptic. Right? Before COVID, 2 billion people were food insecure, which is to say that you don't at some point during the month know whether you'll have enough money to be able to put food on the table. Of those, there's a class of people who are way worse off. It's not merely not knowing whether food is going to be on the table or not, but you're actively malnourished. And although the definition of malnutrition is a little kind of, it's a political football, but we know that around 820 million people were food insecure, were malnourished for a year, up to the point of COVID. So what the UN, as you mentioned in your introduction, Anne, is projecting is famine of biblical proportions, as if 800 odd million people already being malnourished wasn't biblically bad. I don't know what Bible they're reading where things are fine until you add another 150 million to that number. But it's, things are already pretty crap. And there's no reason to think that things won't get substantially worse, because let's look at what happened globally last time. Again, after the Great Recession, which is really a sort of knee-high version of what it is we're going through now, we saw the number of Americans who are food insecure rocket up from 35 million to 50 million. And we had barely returned to it had been about 40 million by the time COVID struck. This time, it's going to be much, much worse. And this is at the same time as Trump is ready to cut food stamps and make increase the work requirements for getting access to SNAP, the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program. And making the access, the rights to food something that's contingent on the ability of you to prove that you're working. And in an economy where there are no jobs, this is really a way to say to working people and their families, drop dead. We already know that 40% of households headed by single women are food insecure. And this number is going through, the numbers are going through the roof. And it's, the US is lucky. We are in a position where countries that we have impoverished are sending workers to us so that they can remit money back home to communities that are far poorer than the ones here. The seizing up of the global economy has been a deep hole in the income of low-income communities in the global south that depend on countries in the global north like ours to be able to send money back. And those kinds of intersections are, those kinds of remittance flows are massive, right? If you think about global aid from rich countries to poor countries, they are dwarfed by the amount of remittances that are sent back by working people working in countries not only in the global north, but just richer countries in the global south, sending money back to poorer countries in the global south. So, for example, in India, under Modi's fascist regime there, and I'm using the word purely in its technical sense, under Modi, migrant workers have been essentially paralyzed on the road, been beaten up by the police, and that's just more visibly the case now. It's a routine part of the way that the police operate in India. But migrant workers, say from Bangladesh, are now not able to send their money back to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is way poorer than India, and the rural communities that depend on the working class in India are in dire straits, and it's pretty certain that countries where there are rural communities that depend on these kinds of remittances are going to be in some, are going to be facing deep levels of malnutrition and poverty as a result. Or we'll have revolution and everything will be fine. So, take your pick.